I took the Vethai's job because Orden and Karth owed me a favor and I needed the coin. And those are the only two reasons a man my age agrees to walk a refugee convoy through a contested forest in the middle of the cold season. Karth ran the transit desk at Sun's Reach Depot, a flat gray building at the edge of the last proper settlement before the Vethai's corridor began. He'd been routing convoys through that corridor for 20 years, longer than the Ketharin Compact had been calling it a contested zone, longer than the Veldari had been losing the kind of territory that produced refugees. He was a small man with large hands and the particular wariness of someone who had spent decades watching the political weather change and learning which way to lean in advance. I'd done 3 jobs for him over the past 6 years, simple route escort work, and he had always paid what he promised and never asked me to do anything I'd regret. That record counted for something. 14 Veldari, he told me, spreading a transit manifest across the desk between us. Mixed, elders, 2 families, a medic. They came out of the Keth lowlands 9 days ago. They want to reach the Aldevar crossing at the far end of the corridor, then north to the neutral settlements. 11 days through the Vethais in cold season, I said. River's up. I know the river's up. Compact patrols have been running the Narrows on and off since autumn. I know about the patrols. Then you know why nobody else took the job. He looked at me for a moment without particular apology. I know why I'm asking you. I was 51 years old. I had spent 14 years doing route work in the border forests after I left the Auxiliary Corps, and before that 8 years in the Corps itself, and before that a childhood in a settlement town not much different from Sun's Reach, which is to say, I had spent the better part of my life in places where the political situation was someone else's emergency, and the practical situation was mine. I knew the Vethai's corridor the way you know a road you've traveled in every season. I knew where it flooded, where the old Veldari track markers were still legible under the moss, where the Narrows pinched tight enough that a patrol could hold the whole corridor by standing in one place. I told Karth I'd do it. He gave me the manifest and a decent advance, and a handshake that lasted a beat longer than business required, which I understood as his way of communicating that he thought the job was harder than the numbers suggested. I met the convoy the next morning at the depot's east staging area, a gravel apron behind the main building where Veldari refugees had been sheltering in prefabricated units for the past week. There were 14 of them, as Karth had said. 3 elder men, a couple with 2 young children, a grandmother traveling with her adult son and his wife and their infant, a young man who seemed to be traveling alone and kept slightly apart from the others, and a woman. That last description is inadequate, but it was the best I could do at the time, because she defied the categories I was trying to sort her into. She was standing near the back of the staging area when I arrived, speaking quietly with one of the elder men, and she was not dressed differently from the others, a gray traveler's coat, worn trail boots, a kit bag over one shoulder, and yet she occupied the space differently. Not in the way of someone who has been important and can't stop performing it. More in the way of someone who has been important for so long that the habit has gone all the way down to the bone and can't be removed, only covered. I noted her and kept moving. The manifest listed her as Sava Keth, healer, traveling alone, mid-30s, Veldari national. I introduced myself to the group, explained the route and timeline, and told them what I needed from them. Quiet, consistent pace. No fires after dark in the first 3 days until we were deep enough in the corridor that the smoke wouldn't carry to the depot roads. Standard transit rules. The elder men listened carefully and asked sensible questions about the river crossing and the condition of the North Face Trail through the second ridge. The couple with the young children exchanged a look that I recognized as the particular silent communication of people who have been afraid for a long time and have gotten good at not showing it. The young man who traveled alone watched me with the careful attention of someone who has learned not to trust easily, but has not yet decided where I fell. The woman, Sava, stood at the edge of the group and listened without asking anything, which told me she had already assessed me and reached a provisional conclusion, and that the conclusion was probably something like competent, cautious, manageable. I've been assessed by a lot of people over the years. I recognize the look. We moved out at first light. The Vethai's corridor is not beautiful in the way of forests that have been left entirely alone. It is beautiful in the way of forests that have been fought over and then abandoned, a secondary growth beauty, full of trees that have grown up through the ruins of older trees, following the light that came in when something else fell. The old Veldari settlement sites are still there if you know where to look, just foundation lines under the moss and the occasional worked stone half swallowed by a root system. Veldari architecture used a particular jointing method for their foundation stones that I'd learned to identify over years of root work. A mortise and tenon approach adapted for natural stone that left distinctive L-shaped notches at the corners. You'd be walking along an ordinary stretch of forest and suddenly there would be a line of those notches in the ground, and you'd realize you were crossing a courtyard or a market square, and the forest would look different after that, fuller somehow, like a place holding its breath. The first 2 days went the way the first 2 days of a well-organized transit usually go. Steady pace, no emergencies, people settling into the rhythm of walking. The cold was real but not brutal, the kind of cold that costs you if you stop for too long but doesn't punish you for moving. The children in the convoy were the most reliable weather indicators I had. When their mood dropped, I watched the sky more carefully, and when they were engaged with the forest pointing at things, asking questions of the adults around them, I let myself breathe a little. The girl named Pell was 9 years old, the elder daughter of the couple with the 2 children, and she was possessed of the particular energy of a child who has been frightened for a long time and has metabolized the fear into a kind of fierce, darting alertness. She noticed everything. She had a habit of walking slightly ahead of her family group and then stopping and waiting for them to catch up, which drove her father quietly frantic. And she had an equally persistent habit of asking questions of anyone within conversational range, which meant that over the first 2 days she worked her way through every adult in the convoy and gathered, I estimated, about 3 times the information she would need to accurately assess the situation. She arrived at me on the morning of the 3rd day. "You know the forest," she said, not a question. "Well enough," I said. "How long have you been coming here?" "Since before you were born." She considered this. "Did it look different before?" "Different how?" "Before," she said, and by the precision of her pause I understood that she meant before the compact's expansion, before the lowland territories changed hands, before whatever had happened to the Veldari in the years that had made this convoy necessary. Before was a large word for a 9-year-old to be carrying around, and she was carrying it carefully. "The trees were smaller," I said, which was true and also the most honest answer I could give to a question that large. She thought about that for a while and then went back to her family. I had been watching Sava without appearing to watch her, because that's a skill you develop in escort work. You learn to have peripheral vision about your clients, to track the state of each person without making your attention obvious, because people on the move in difficult situations don't want to feel surveilled. They want to feel accompanied. There's a difference, and getting it wrong makes everything harder. What I noticed about Sava in those first 2 days was this. She was competent in ways that were slightly out of register with her stated role. She had introduced herself as a healer, and she was clearly that. When the grandmother's son wrenched his ankle on a route on the first afternoon, Sava was there before I was, and the assessment and wrapping she did was quick and assured and correct. But she did other things too. Small organizational things that weren't medical. On the second morning, she had quietly redistributed some of the supply weight among the kit bags in a way that improved the group's pace by reducing the load on the 2 people whose gait I'd marked as the limiting factors for distance. She hadn't announced this. She'd just done it, in the half hour before we moved out, while I was checking the route ahead. That afternoon, I watched her talk to the young man who traveled alone, the cautious one, for about 20 minutes while we were stopped at a stream crossing. By the end of the conversation, his posture had changed. Not dramatically, but measurably. Some of the rigid held-in quality was gone, and in the 2 days after that he integrated more naturally with the group. She was managing them. Not with authority, she was scrupulously not doing it with authority, but with the practiced, quiet efficiency of someone who has spent a long time keeping a group of people functional under difficult circumstances. I kept my observations to myself. On the 4th evening, I made a fire at the campsite I'd been planning to use. We were deep enough into the corridor by then that the smoke risk was acceptable. And after the convoy had eaten and the children were asleep, and most of the adults had found their sleeping arrangements, I sat by the fire doing what I always do at the end of a day's movement, which is review the next day's route in my head and account for whatever the day had changed in my assessments. Sava came and sat across the fire from me. Not immediately. She gave it a few minutes of appearing to be doing something else, which was its own kind of information. Then she settled on the log I'd positioned as a bench and drew her coat around her, and said nothing for long enough that I understood she wasn't there to make conversation. After a while she said, "How many times have you brought convoys through here?" 11, I said. This corridor specifically, more if you count adjacent routes. How many since the compact started running the narrows? 3. She looked at the fire. Did you have trouble? Once, I said. A patrol captain who wanted to make it trouble. I had papers and I knew the protocol, and eventually he got bored. And if he hadn't gotten bored, then I would have made the transit a different way, and it would have taken longer. She absorbed that. The fire settled, and I added a piece of wood, and the sound of the forest was the particular layered stillness of a cold night, the kind of quiet that has texture to it, different sounds at different distances, the creek to the east and something large moving far off to the north, and the breathing of 14 sleeping or near-sleeping people in the camp behind us. You don't ask questions, she said. I ask the questions I need to do the job. What questions do you need that you haven't asked yet? I thought about that honestly. None, I said. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I used to know this forest. Did you? Not this part specifically, but the southern end where the old Keth settlements are. She stopped. I spent time there as a child before. Before again. The same word Pell had used with the same precise weight. The foundation stones are still there, I said. Mortise and tenon jointing. You can trace the whole settlement plan if you know what you're looking for. She looked up from the fire and looked at me directly for the first time. Not the peripheral assessment she'd been running since we met, but directly, and something shifted in her face that I couldn't immediately categorize. Not surprise exactly. More like the expression of someone who has been braced for a certain kind of response and received something different. Yes, she said, exactly. We sat by the fire for another half hour and didn't say much else, and then she thanked me for the warmth and went to her sleeping arrangement, and I sat alone for a while and looked at the fire and thought about the fact that she had said I used to know this forest with a possessive specificity that didn't fit the biography of a lowland healer who happened to have spent time in the South as a child. I went asleep and didn't do anything with the thought except file it. The next 7 days were the core of the transit, the long middle section where you find out who the convoy actually is. In the planning stages, everyone is a category on a manifest: elder, couple, children, healer. In the walking, they become people, and the people are always more complicated than the categories. The elder men turned out to have been colleagues in some professional capacity that they never specified but that I read as administrative, possibly governmental, from the way they occasionally lapsed into a more formal register with each other and then caught themselves and daled back. One of them, the tallest of the three, had a habit of looking at the forest as we moved through it in a way that was more than transit awareness. He was reading it, marking it, the way a man does when he once knew a landscape well, and is measuring what it has become against what he remembers it being. I mentioned this to no one. On the fifth evening, I came across him at the edge of camp, standing very still near a line of those distinctive foundation stones I had pointed out to Sava, and he stood there for a long time without moving. When he finally turned back to camp, his face was composed in the particular way of a man who has just put something heavy down somewhere it will stay. The grandmother's son was under significant strain that he was managing with a tightness around his eyes I kept in my peripheral vision, not because I thought he was dangerous, but because strain like that needs somewhere to go, and better that I knew about it than that it surprised me. His wife was calm in the deep way of someone who has already done the hardest thing and knows that what comes next is simply a matter of continuing. She was the kind of person who, in every situation the convoy encountered, did the next necessary thing without commenting on it or requiring acknowledgement, and I noticed that several times Sava positioned herself near the woman in the evenings, not to talk, just to be present, and the woman's posture would ease by a degree that mattered. The young man who traveled alone was named Vesthar. After Sava's conversation with him on day 2 he talked more, and I learned that he had been a student before things fell apart, and that he was traveling to meet an uncle at the northern settlements, and that he was 22 years old, and had never been in a forest before the past 9 days. He said this last part with a kind of rueful wonder, as though the forest were a fact about himself he was still processing. On the 6th day, he found a bird's nest that had been blown down by the previous night's wind, intact and empty and perfectly constructed, and he carried it the rest of that day's walk before carefully setting it on a rock at camp and studying it as though it might reveal something. I told him the species that built it and something about the construction method, and we talked for a while, and I thought that, under different circumstances, he would have been one of those people who learn a new subject with a thoroughness that becomes its own kind of expertise. Pell continued to gather information with relentless efficiency. She was also, I noticed, conducting a systematic study of Sava, not obviously, in the way children sometimes fixate on an adult who interests them, but with a careful circumspection that seemed almost deliberate for her age. She would find excuses to walk near Sava and then not initiate conversation, just walk, just exist in proximity. And Sava for her part would let the girl do it, and occasionally she would say something brief and specific to Pell, a comment about a plant they were passing or a bird call in the canopy, and Pell would receive it as though it were more important than it appeared. On the 7th evening Pell fell asleep before supper was finished, sitting upright, which is the kind of sleep that only happens when a body has been going longer than its owner's willpower can sustain. Her father moved to carry her to her sleeping kit, and Sava was there first, so smoothly and without fuss that the father simply stopped and watched as Sava picked the girl up and carried her. It was done with the ease of long practice. Pell barely stirred, just turned her face into Sava's shoulder with the total unconscious trust of a child being carried by someone whose arm she knows. The father watched this happen and then looked at the fire. I had the impression that these two already knew each other, or had known each other, and that something about the present situation meant they were both performing a version of not knowing each other, and doing it for the same reasons. I filed that too and kept moving. On the 8th day, we crossed the river. I had been watching the water level since the 2nd day, because the Vethais River crossing at the mid-corridor ford is the one place in the transit where the margin for error is genuinely small. In good conditions it's knee-deep and rocky, 20 meters of careful walking. In bad conditions it's chest-deep and fast, and you rope the group together, and accept that everyone is going to be soaked and cold for the rest of the day, and that someone is probably going to go down and be caught by the rope, and that this will be frightening and exhausting but not fatal if the roping is correct. The conditions on day 8 were somewhere between good and bad, which is to say they were the most demanding kind. deep enough at the center channel to be genuinely difficult, but not deep enough to justify the full roping protocol, which meant I had to make a judgment call about each person individually. I made the calls. The elder men went across in pairs, arm-linked, and were fine. They had the weight and the steadiness of their years working for them. The couple with the children went as a unit, the father carrying the younger child, the mother holding Pell's hand and mine, and I got them across the center channel and onto the far bank without incident. The grandmother's son went across with Vesthar, which I had arranged deliberately because Vesthar needed an anchor and the grandmother's son needed to be useful, and that pairing served both. The grandmother herself went across with me in a second pass and swore under her breath at the cold water with a creativity that suggested she had once known a great many soldiers. Sava went last, at her own insistence. I had expected her to insist, and I had positioned myself to agree because she was clearly capable of crossing alone, and because the instinct to go last, to make sure everyone else was across before yourself, was one I recognized and respected. What I had not expected was what happened at the center channel. The river had an irregular bottom there, old flood debris redistributed by the season's high water, and there was a place about 2/3 of the way across where the channel dropped unexpectedly by about half a meter. I knew it was there and I had told the group to watch for it, and everyone else had navigated it fine. But at that exact spot the current was also at its strongest, and when Sava's foot found the drop, the combination of the depth and the current pushed her off her line. She went down on one knee into the current. Not into the water, her reactions were fast, and her other foot found purchase almost immediately. But she was knee-deep in moving water for several seconds, and the current had hold of the lower half of her pack and was trying to take it, and for a moment it was genuinely uncertain. I was already there. I had been 2 steps behind her, and I came up alongside and took the weight of the pack above the current's pull and put my other hand against her arm, not gripping, just steadying, and said, "I've got the weight, take your time." And she found her footing and we came out of it and crossed to the far bank without drama. She stood on the bank and looked at the river for a moment and then looked at me. "Thank you," she said. "Standard crossing problem," I said. "The bottom shifts after high water." She looked at me for another second and then nodded, and I went to check on the rest of the convoy. That night after camp was established and the group had eaten, I noticed that Pell was sitting very close to Sava by the fire, closer than she had been on any previous evening, her small shoulder pressed against Sava's arm. And Sava had one hand resting on the top of the girl's head, the lightest kind of contact, barely a weight at all. Not the gesture of an acquaintance, something older than that. I made my usual end-of-day route review and went to sleep. Days 9 and 10 were clear and cold and steady, and we made good distance, and I let myself begin to calculate the endpoint with something like confidence. The Aldevar crossing was 1 solid day ahead of us, possibly 1.5 if the North Face Trail was as muddy as the recent overnight temperatures suggested it would be. The convoy was intact, healthy within the margins except on any transit, and there had been no sign of compact activity since the 3rd day, when we'd heard a patrol vehicle on one of the depot roads far to the east, and then heard nothing more. On the 9th day, we passed through what I had always privately thought of as the corridor's central room, a natural clearing about 80 meters across where a section of old growth had come down in a storm at some point in the distant past, and the new growth that had come up since was still young enough that the clearing kept its shape, a bright open space in the middle of the corridor's green density. The old growth stumps were enormous, some of them moss-covered to the point of being almost indistinguishable from boulders, and the Veldari foundation stones ran in a long, deliberate line through the center of the clearing, which meant that the clearing itself was probably built, that once it had been an open market square or a gathering place, and the forest had reclaimed it, and then the storm had given it back, and now it was both things at once. The convoy stopped without my asking them to stop, all 14 of them and me, standing in that clearing, looking at it. The elder men stood very close together. Pel's father had his hand on his wife's arm in the way of a man who needs the contact as much as he is offering it. The grandmother's son was looking at the foundation stones with an expression I had no language for. Vesthar stood with his arms crossed, very still, and I thought about his 22 years and how much of the world he had lost before he'd had time to learn what it was. Pel was looking at the stones the way she looked at everything, with that particular cataloging attention, processing, storing. But she was also, I noticed, holding her mother's hand, which she had not done since the first day. Her mother's hand closed around hers without comment. Sava stood near the center of the clearing, and she was looking up. Not at the stones. At the sky above the clearing, the pale, cold season sky visible through the open space in the canopy, and her face was turned upward in a way that had nothing to do with navigation or assessment. That was entirely about something else, something interior that the open sky above a clearing in a contested forest had unlocked or touched. The light came down into the clearing at a low angle, the kind of winter light that travels a long way to get where it is going, and it caught the ash gray of her coat and the copper of her hair, and for a moment she looked entirely like someone who belonged in that specific place, in that specific light, which was not a thing I had expected to think, and which I did not examine closely in the moment. I gave them 10 minutes. Nobody looked at me to ask permission. Nobody needed to. Then we moved. On the evening of the 10th day, I updated my assessment of the transit from difficult to likely successful, which is not the same as successful, but is better than difficult. On the morning of the 11th day, 2 hours into the walk, we came around the turn at the Vethais Narrows and found the checkpoint. It had been set up recently. Within the past day, I estimated from the equipment staging. 2 transport vehicles parked across the trail at the point where the corridor pinched between a granite outcropping and a steep boggy slope that would cost 2 hours to go around, and 4 men in compact administrative gray with a 5th man who was clearly in charge. He had the particular ease of manner of someone who knows that his position is currently advantageous and is in no hurry, and he was wearing a scanner rig on a shoulder harness, the kind used for biological identification at contested zone checkpoints. I had my papers in order. I always have my papers in order. This was a legal checkpoint under the Compact's transit protocols, which I had read carefully when those protocols were first published 3 years ago, and I knew what they could and couldn't require of a civilian escort with a properly registered transit manifest. I raised my hand to stop the convoy behind me and walked forward. "Transit escort registered out of Sun's Reach," I said. "I have papers and a full manifest. 14 passengers, all Veldari nationals with current transit documentation." The man in charge, he gave his name as Envoy Adjutant Pel Sorath, which I noted was a coincidence I put aside, looked at my papers with the unhurried attention of someone performing thoroughness rather than practicing it. "This is a biological screening checkpoint," he said. "Routine, all passengers will be scanned. Your protocol allows for documentation review in lieu of biological screening for registered civilian transits," I said. "That provision is suspended in active contested zones," he said. "This corridor has been reclassified." I had not been informed of the reclassification, which I noted without expression, and I looked at the scanner rig and did the calculation that I had been, on some level, running since the 8th evening without fully articulating it to myself. The convoy had stopped behind me. I could hear the quality of the silence. I have been in enough difficult situations to know the difference between the silence of people waiting to see what happens and the silence of people who already know what is going to happen and are holding very still inside that knowledge. The second silence is much quieter. "Proceed with the documentation review first," I said. "Biological screening is secondary protocol." Sareth looked at me with a mild, impersonal patience that was exactly as threatening as he intended it to be. Biological screening is primary protocol at this checkpoint. The documentation review will follow. He spoke to one of his men without looking away from me. Begin with the group. I stepped to the side, but I did not step back to the convoy, and I watched. His man moved through the group with the scanner, which read biological signatures at close range through a contact point on the shoulder strap, and I watched the scanner's readout screen on the rig from where I was standing. Most of the readings were routine. The screen cycled through assessment codes in a pale yellow that meant civilian registered, nothing flagged. The elder men, the couple, the children, Vesthar, the grandmother and her family, yellow, yellow, yellow. When the scanner reached Sava, it cycled through a longer red than the others. Then it showed a different color. Not yellow, a deeper amber, and then a code I didn't know, but I could read the shape of it, the number of characters, the prefix marker. And I had been doing route work in Veldari territory long enough to know that certain prefix markers in compact scanning protocol meant royal bloodline confirmation. The scanner man stopped walking. Sareth looked at his readout. The convoy went absolutely still. And I mean that precisely, not the collective held breath stillness of people waiting for a verdict, but a different stillness altogether. A stillness with a specific Veldari texture that I had never seen before in 14 years of route work. A stillness that happens when a group of people all simultaneously lower their eyes. All of them, every adult in the convoy, and Vesthar, and even the grandmother's infant. I cannot explain the infant except to say that the quality of the silence had changed enough that even the youngest thing in the group responded to it. They all lowered their eyes. Except Pell. Pell was 9 years old and she had been carrying something for 11 days, and she had been very careful and very controlled for 11 days, in the way that a child who loves someone is careful and controlled when she has been told by every adult around her to be careful and controlled. And the sight of that amber code on the scanner screen broke the 11 days open. She made a sound first. A small sound, not quite a word, that came from somewhere very deep in her chest. And then she said, in a voice that was not loud but that carried through the absolute silence of the corridor with perfect clarity. Saving Keth Veldari, Queen Regnant of the Keth Accord. Every title, full honorific form, the kind of form that means you were taught to say it from childhood, that it was the kind of name you learned the way you learn the name of something sacred. The silence that followed was of a different quality from the one that had preceded it. Sareth's hand moved toward his sidearm. He did not reach it. I was between him and Sava before his hand had completed the motion, not because I had planned the geometry of it in advance, but because the geometry was the only one that made sense from where I was standing, and my body understood that before my head did. I was not armed. I had never carried weapons on transit work, because weapons escalate and escort work is fundamentally about de-escalation. What I had was my body and my position and 11 days, and I put all three between Sareth's hand and Saving Keth Veldari. Sareth stopped. He looked at me with an expression that had shifted from mild, impersonal patience to something harder and more uncertain. Behind me, I could hear Sava. I could not see her, I was facing Sareth, but I could hear her breathing, and I could hear in her breathing the particular quality of someone who has been holding something compressed for a very long time and has just had it released without warning. I looked at Sareth and I said, "She is under my escort, she is on my registered transit manifest, and the Compact's own charter prohibits the detention or harm of any civilian in a registered transit during an active documentation review. The documentation review is not complete." Sareth's hand was still near his sidearm, but not on it. "That charter provision," he said, "does not apply to royal bloodline classifications." "Show me the specific exemption," I said. "In writing. Because I have the charter on my data card and I've read it, and what it says is that the escort's registered transit takes precedence over field classification unless the escort has been formally accused of facilitation of criminal activity. I haven't been. The documentation review is not complete. He looked at me for a long time. I am not a large man. I'm a 51-year-old man of average height with the particular kind of leanness that comes from spending years walking in difficult terrain, and I have a scar across my left jaw from a piece of rock debris in a situation I do not particularly like to think about, and I have the kind of eyes that people who know me describe as hard to read. I am not impressive in any obvious way. I don't project the kind of authority that stops people in their tracks. What I project, when I need to, is this: the complete absence of any indication that I am going to move. Sareth looked at me, and then he looked past me, and I did not turn around to see what he saw, but I can reconstruct it. Sava standing there, and the convoy standing there, and Pell still with the sound of the Queen's full name and title fatting from the air, and 14 Veldari people who had lowered their eyes and were now, in the way of people who are watching something that they have given up hope of seeing, beginning to raise them again. "Escort," he said, and his voice had changed, not much, but in the way of a man who has run a calculation and found that the numbers don't support his next move. "This classification will be reported." "Report it," I said. "My documentation is current. My transit is registered. The documentation review will be completed now, and when it is complete, my transit will continue." He completed the documentation review. It took another 40 minutes, and they were 40 minutes during which no one in the convoy said anything, and I stood where I was standing, and Sareth and his men moved through the paperwork with a thoroughness that was, this time, real, because they were looking for something that would give them a different calculation, and they didn't find it, because my papers were in order and always have been. When the review was complete, Sareth said that the transit could proceed. He did not look at me when he said it. I thanked him for his compliance with proper protocol and walked back to the convoy. I walked past the elder men and past the couple and their children and past Vesthar and the grandmother's family, and I walked to the back of the group, where Sava was standing, and she was standing the way I imagined she stood when she was in whatever place she had been before she became a refugee in a forest. Not the controlled stillness of a person managing herself, but the natural stillness of someone who has been returned to their own axis and is standing on it. Pell was pressed against her side with both arms around Sava's waist, her face turned into the gray coat. Sava had one hand resting on the back of the girl's head, the same light contact as the evening by the fire, barely a weight at all, except that everything had changed around it. I stopped in front of her. She looked at me. Her eyes were the color I had known they were for several days, pale silver with horizontal pupils, the distinctive Veldari royal coloring that appears in historical records if you know what to look for, and they were very bright in the cold light of the corridor. She didn't say anything immediately, and I didn't need her to. "We're 2 hours from the North Face Trail." I said, "If we move now, we can be through the worst of the mud before the afternoon freeze sets it." She held my eyes for a moment that was longer than the sentence required. "Yes," she said, "all right." I turned and told the convoy to move. We walked. Nobody said anything for the first half hour after the checkpoint. Not the elder men, not Vesthar, not the couple with the children, not even Pell. The silence had a different quality from the silences that come from fatigue or cold. It was a thinking silence, the kind that happens when a group of people are separately processing the same thing, and none of them have found the words for it yet. I walked at the front and I let it be. After a while, Pell came up and walked beside me for 20 minutes without speaking, which was unusual for her. Then she went back to her family without comment, and I heard the sound of her parents' voices behind me, low and steady, and eventually the quiet began to loosen at the edges the way it does when the pressing thing is past, and the ordinary sounds of movement start to fill the space again. The North Face Trail was muddy, and the afternoon freeze came earlier than I'd hoped, and the last 2 hours of that day's walking were uncomfortable in the solid, unavoidable way of walking through cold mud in failing light. And nobody complained about any of it, because 11 days in a forest will calibrate your sense of what is worth complaining about. I put us into camp on a high shelf above the main trail. A site I'd used before that had a natural windbreak from a granite formation to the north and good drainage. And we made a fire and ate, and the children fell asleep early, and the adults settled into the end-of-day quiet that convoys find when they're close enough to the end to begin to believe in it. Sava came to the fire when the camp was established, and she sat across from me, and this time there was no period of appearing to be doing something else. She just sat down. The elder men sat nearby, not intrusively, but in the way of people who have quietly decided that proximity to this fire was important to them. The tallest one, the one who had stood so long at the foundation stones on the 5th evening, met my eyes when he settled and gave me a single nod of the kind that doesn't require or expect a response. Vesthar sat a little farther out, with the grandmother's son, the two of them talking in low voices about something that didn't require my attention. The couple with the children had arranged their sleeping kits nearby, and the father was lying with his eyes open in the particular way of a man who is not sleeping and is grateful for the fire. Pell was asleep, curled tight, her face toward Sava. I looked at the fire. After a while Sava said, "You knew." "I didn't know," I said. "I knew something was different from the manifest." "Different how?" "The way you managed the group," I said. "The weight redistribution on day 2, the conversation with Vesthar, the way you went last at the river even though you were the strongest person in the convoy after me and you knew it and so did everyone else. The way Pell looked at you." I paused. "The way all of them looked at you when the scanner went amber." She was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. "I've been Sava for 11 days, she said. "For 11 days I've been someone else's problem to manage, someone's cargo to deliver safely. It was," she stopped, looked for a word. "It was rest," she said finally. "That's what it was." I thought about that. Was it the first time in a while? "Since the accord collapsed," she said. 2 years, yes." We sat with that for a while. "Pell's family," I said. "They were your people before." "Her mother was a court administrator," Sava said. "Pell was born in the residential quarter. She would have been 7 when things fell apart." A pause. "She knew me before she knew me as anything other than what I am. Children that age, they don't have the second layer yet. The one that learns to see what's in front of them instead of what's underneath." "She tried," I said. "She really tried to hold it in." Something crossed Sava's face. Not quite a smile, but in the family of one, a thing that had the structure of warmth without the uncomplicated ease of it. "She did," she said. "She's been trying since the first morning." I looked at the fire. "When the scanner went amber," I said, "you knew what was going to happen next." "Yes." "And you were going to let it." She didn't answer immediately. "I was going to," she said, with a particular flatness that wasn't defeat, more like honesty about a decision she had made before the moment arrived. "The accord is gone. My court is scattered. What's left of my household is in pieces across 4 neutral territories. There is no—" She stopped again, and this time the pause was longer, and I let it be long. "There's no one left who needs me to be what the scanner said I am. Pell's family needs to reach the northern settlements. The elders need to reach the northern settlements. Vesthar needs to reach his uncle. They don't need a queen. They need an escort." "They have an escort," I said. She looked at me. "You've been doing what you do," I said. "The weight redistribution, Vesthar, the river, Pell. You've been doing it because it's what you do, and you've been calling it rest, and maybe it is both things at once." I looked back at the fire. "But the reason I stepped in front of Sareth today had nothing to do with what the scanner said." She waited. "I've been moving people through this corridor for 14 years, I said. "Different people every time, different situations, different manifest categories. What I know about doing this job is that the people who hold a group together in difficult conditions are almost never the ones listed as group leaders on the documentation. They're the ones who redistribute the weight on day 2 without being asked, who know which conversation to have with which frightened person, who go last at the river. I looked at her. I stepped in front of Sareth because I've been watching you hold this convoy together for 11 days in a forest in the cold season, and that makes you my passenger, and my passengers don't get touched at my checkpoints. The silver eyes were very bright now, in the way of eyes that are accumulating something. Halrin, she said, my name plainly, without any of the management I'd felt in previous conversations, just my name, the way Pell had said the Queen's name in the Narrows, because it was the true name and the moment had broken the container for it. We're 2 hours from Aldevar tomorrow, I said. If the mud has frozen solid overnight, maybe less. She breathed out, not a sigh, something that had more in it than a sigh. A breath that was also an acknowledgement of something that was not the same as what it had been before she breathed it out. Tell me about the Aldevar crossing, she said. I told her. The bridge conditions at this time of year, the settlement on the far bank, the routes north and which ones were passable, and which required specific documentation at the compact's northern waypost. I told her the things a healer would need to know, and I told her the other things, the administrative contacts in the neutral settlements who could be trusted, the organizations that were working in the resettlement zones, the names of people who had helped other Veldari convoys navigate the period after arrival. She listened in the way she had always listened to me, which was with the full attention of someone who never had to hear something twice. We talked until the fire was low. The last morning of the transit was cold and clear, the mud frozen hard as I'd hoped, and we made the Aldevar Bridge in under 2 hours. The crossing itself was routine. The settlement on the far bank had a compact waypost, and the documentation review there was brief and without incident, different officers, different culture. The north was always different, and when it was done, I walked the convoy to the transit staging area where the northbound transports would stop. I found the schedule board and identified the transport that would take them to the first neutral settlement, departing in 3 hours, and I confirmed that their documentation was recognized and their names were on the transit list. The convoy gathered in the staging area. The elder men shook my hand with the particular gravity of men who have a great deal of feeling and limited vocabulary for expressing it, and are doing their best. The tallest one held my hand for a moment longer than the others and said, in the careful, formal way that I now recognized as his natural register rather than his managed one, that he hoped the corridor would treat me well in the coming seasons. The grandmother's son gripped my arm at the elbow in a gesture I recognized as a formal Veldari thanks. He'd been more formal since the Narrows, as though the Narrows had given him permission to acknowledge what had been unspoken. Vesthar said goodbye in a voice that was trying to be casual and not quite managing it, which was fine, and then at the last moment he took the empty bird's nest from his pack. He had been carrying it the whole way, I realized, and looked at it, and then carefully, very carefully, packed it back again, which told me everything I needed to know about where he was going to land when he got to where he was going. The couple with the children thanked me with the focused brevity of people who have more emotions than they can currently process and are making do. Pell threw both arms around my waist and pressed her face into my coat and stayed like that for a few seconds without saying anything, and I put a hand on the back of her head in a gesture I had borrowed without meaning to, and then she stepped back and looked up at me with her darting, assessing eyes and said, "You'll come back through the corridor." "Probably," I said. "I'm going to be in the northern settlements," she said, "not here." "I know. You should learn the northern routes," she said, with the confidence of someone issuing an entirely reasonable instruction to an adult who has not yet understood the full scope of what is required of them. "I'll think about it," I said. She gave me the look of a 9-year-old who has heard that before, and went back to her family. Sava was last. She had been standing slightly apart, watching the goodbyes, in a way that I understood now as not management and not distance, but a kind of witnessing, taking in the scene the way someone takes in something they want to remember accurately. When the others had moved to the staging area benches, she walked to where I was standing. We were outside the waypost building, in the cold morning light, and the transport staging area was busy with the ordinary bustle of a border settlement waypost. Other travelers, other transits, other documentation reviews, other convoys at various points in their own difficult passages. She was Sava Keth on the transit documentation that had carried her through the corridor, and she was Savin Keth Veldari on a scanner that read what the documentation didn't say. And she was both of those things, and also the woman who had redistributed the pack weight on day 2 and talked Vesthar back to himself, and gone last at the river and held Pell's head in her hands by the fire at night. And those things were the same person. The contacts you mentioned, she said, in the resettlement zone, the organizations. I'll write them down. I'll remember them, she said, but write them down anyway. I wrote them on a slip of paper from the note card I keep in my jacket pocket, and I gave it to her, and she held it for a moment. What you said at the fire, she said, about why you stepped in front of Sorath. Yes. You didn't know when you took this job. No. And it wouldn't have mattered. No, I said, it wouldn't have. She was quiet for a moment. The cold morning air moved between us, carrying the sound of the settlement, the transit noise, the ordinary sounds of a border crossing doing its ordinary work. The contacts will take me some time to work through, she said. There's more to rebuild than I knew how to think about while we were in the forest. The forest made it possible to not think about it. That's what forests are for, I said. She looked at me, and there was something in her face that had not been there on the first morning at the staging area in Sun's Reach. Not softness. She had never been soft, but openness. The particular openness of someone who has let a carefully maintained surface fall away and is not currently reconstructing it. Halrin Voss, she said. My full name, the way she had said just my first name at the fire plainly without layers. Retired escort, knows the Vethai's corridor, reads Veldari foundation stones. That's about right, I said. If the northern routes need walking, she said, and the sentence stopped there, but it was not an incomplete sentence. It was a sentence that knew where it was going and had stopped at the point where I could see the direction. Then I'd need someone who knows the northern settlements, I said, the administrative landscape, the resettlement organizations, the people worth trusting. She held my eyes. Give me 6 months, she said. The contacts, the rebuilding, the north. 6 months to put the first pieces back into something that can stand. 6 months, I said. Then come north. I looked at her for a moment. This woman who had been a refugee in my manifest and a healer in the convoy and a queen at a scanner, and a person sitting across a fire talking about foundation stones, all of those things at once, none of them diminishing any other. All right, I said. The transport announced its boarding call. She looked at the transit staging area, at the group she had held together across 11 days and a forest and a checkpoint, loading their kit bags onto the transport with the focused efficiency of people who have gotten very good at moving. Then she looked back at me. Thank you, she said, not for the checkpoint, for the 11 days. It was a good transit, I said. She held my eyes for one more moment, and then she walked to the transport, and she got on, and the boarding closed, and I stood on the platform in the cold northern light and watched the transport move away through the waypost gates toward the first neutral settlement. I stood there for a while after it was gone. Then I found a coffee vendor in the waypost building and got a cup of something that was only approximately coffee and sat in the waiting area and thought about the northern routes and how long they would take to learn properly and what kind of documentation you needed for the waypost at the compact's northern perimeter and whether Karth at Sun's Reach had contacts in the northern depot system, the way he had contacts in the south. 6 months. I thought about a 9-year-old girl who had been carrying a queen's name in her chest for 11 days through a cold forest, and had let it out when it mattered most, which was exactly what it needed to do and exactly when it needed to do it. And I thought about a woman standing in absolute stillness on a frozen riverbank in the Vethai's Narrows, not the managed stillness of someone composing themselves, but the natural stillness of someone who has been returned to their own axis and knows it. I drank the approximate coffee and thought about the northern routes. 6 months is a long time, and it is also not very long at all, depending on what you are counting toward. I put the empty cup down and picked up my kit bag and went to find the southbound transport back to Sun's Reach, because I had a corridor to log and papers to file and a debt to settle with Orden and Karth. And after that, I had 6 months to learn a new set of roads. I've always been good at roads.